Hi everyone, thanks for joining our webinar where we're going to take you through the roadmap for the finance sector that's been developed to support financial institutions to assess commodity-driven deforestation risks. This webinar is being recorded and there will be plenty of time at the end for a Q&A session, so please do use the Q&A function in the webinar to store up any questions you'd like to ask the panel. I'd like to say a really warm welcome to our speakers. We have Steph Kimball, the Director of Climate Change Strategy at Conservation International, and one of our partners on the Finance and Deforestation Advisory Group. We have Olga Hancock, Senior Engagement Analyst at Church Commissioners of England, one of the signatories to the letter announced at COP committing to eliminating deforestation from portfolios. And finally, we'll hear from Emma Thompson, the Technical Lead on the Finance Sector Roadmap at Global Canopy. So to kick us off, our first presentation is from Stephanie, who's going to take us through the context and why we need a finance sector roadmap. So over to you, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. So I'd like to start with just a bit of context at what we saw at COP26 just last month. We saw nature on the agenda like never before. Importantly, we saw actions from government, the finance sector, civil society, public and private, all coming together around the importance of forests and nature to solving climate change. So I'd like to walk through these a bit. The first is on the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forest and Land Use. This was signed by over 141 countries committing to end deforestation by 2030. This is imperative as it provides that support and that commitment from governments to really transition the entire global operations into a forest positive future. Additionally, at the actual negotiations, the Paris Rulebook was finalized to include nature in Article 6 as an eligible activity. We saw an incredible amount of funding from public and private sector toward forest action, and very critically, a lot of support for tenure rights for Indigenous peoples and local communities, which is such a critical issue to ensure that the people on the front lines of this work have the support they need. And then what we're talking about today here is related to this commitment you see at the bottom of the slide, where we saw 30 leading financial institutions with over 8.7 trillion in assets under management committing to tackle deforestation together by 2025. Next slide, please. So why did we see this finance sector commitment at COP when most people think of COPs as for government announcements? Well, in advance of COP26, the UK COP26 presidency, along with Mark Carney's Private Finance Hub and the High-Level Climate Action Champions, issued a call to action for the finance sector. One of the key transformative actions they called for was addressing the financing of deforestation that results from unsustainable commodity production. There was a strong desire for COP26 to be an inflection point to show how national governments, the finance sector, corporations could all come together and create that virtuous spiral of ambition to really get us on track toward our Paris Agreement goals. So these 30 financial institutions really stepped up to that call and showed that they're front runners on tackling this issue. Next slide, please. So what was actually committed in this letter? What we saw was the 2025 commitment is specific to the commodities that are the largest drivers of deforestation: palm, soy, pulp and paper, and cattle products. So by engaging companies in their the companies in their portfolios who have a high risk of deforestation, it will encourage and support the shift on the ground to deforestation-free production practices of these commodities to cause that real change and create a huge shift in finance toward nature-based and forest-positive solutions. There's also several interim benchmarks on the way to 2025 that are critical. One of them is on the public risk disclosure. So really that will encourage the joint learning and information sharing among the finance institutions to show what data needs there are, what additional support is needed from governments and from corporates to really make this change happen. There's also elements on establishing policies to address the exposure that is in their portfolios and to prevent exposure going forward. Next slide, please. So why is this commitment so important for the global effort to stop climate change? Well, 8% of global emissions currently come from the unsustainable practices of just these commodities, which is more than the entire EU. So if we are going to stop deforestation to stop the Paris Agreement, or to get to the Paris Agreement goals, we have to figure this out. One of the key things here is that we see a lot of net zero commitments for the climate in the climate space, but we cannot address net zero if we don't address deforestation. So one of the incentives that we're seeing here is imbalanced. What we see is that there is funding for activities that drive deforestation that outweighs those that are for sustainable production and conservation at a 40 times disparity. We must address both of these issues if we're going to tip the scales and flip that flow of finance toward a people and nature positive supply chain. Next slide. The imbalance in current incentives poses a risk not only for our ability to achieve our global climate goals, but also for financial institutions that have exposure to these deforestation risks. The commitment we saw at COP shows that the finance sector acknowledges the need to act on this to avoid impacts associated with all of the risks that you can see listed on the right side of this slide. It's very important to see that there's a lot of different types of risks here, not just financial risks, but also operational risks. There's environmental, social governance risks. There's lots of reasons that the finance sector has highlighted that this is an issue that they're ready to tackle. And we're excited to be able to provide this roadmap that can help them to do that. Next slide, please. So to support the financial institutions who are already on the path to addressing deforestation and to help those who are just joining the effort to get started, we've created an aligned roadmap that combines all of the relevant data and guidance in a stepwise approach that meets institutions where they are on this journey. Sarah and Emma will be walking us through that roadmap in a few minutes, but what we hope to see is that this roadmap will allow the finance sector to implement their commitments with confidence and build on the momentum we saw at COP26 that will result in more and more members of the finance sector taking on this issue in concert with the necessary government support to level the playing field and corporate action to encourage the true systems shift of production practices that will get us to zero deforestation and keep the Paris Agreement 1.5 degree goal within sight. Back over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Stephanie. And thanks so much for that presentation. It's wonderful to be reminded of the role the finance sector plays and the long way to go into shifting that financing, like the discrepancy that you highlighted there. So now I'm going to hand over to Olga Hancock, and Olga is going to give her perspective on the challenges that the finance sector is facing.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you very much, Stephanie, for taking us through that. So I was going to specifically speak to the letter which Stephanie referred to. So I work for the Church Commissioners for England. We're a 9.1 billion endowment of the Church of England. And we were proudly one of the 30 investors which signed up to the letter at COP. And I thought what would be helpful would be to go through the different parts of the letter, which basically reflect what's included in the roadmap, and explain where we are and aren't up to at the moment. And then hopefully the discussions of the roadmap will address some of these concerns. So I'll go through the three different steps. So the first step, as Stephanie mentioned, was by the end of 2022 to assess exposure to deforestation risk through financing or investment in clients and holdings which focus on forest risk commodities, as mentioned, and also there's to engage on policy to support an enabling environment for business to avoid deforestation risks and impacts. So in terms of what we are doing already, we do actually run a quarterly controversies screen against our entire listed equities portfolio. And we've got a natural capital assessment of the whole portfolio. So we are looking at nature more generally, and our controversy screen, the one specific to the listed equities portfolio, looks at a whole range of different environmental factors, deforestation being one of those. So what that does pick up is where there's really serious issues that have been picked up by the data provider. So we have been for some time very actively engaging with several companies around the world on issues in relation to deforestation and soft commodities, because that was picked up as part of our screening process. So the really critical problems where there's either a real human rights violation because of FPIC relating to these soft commodities and infringement onto traditional lands, or otherwise where there's a real environmental issues such as destruction of high conservation value rainforest. So we've got those engagements. We're also involved in a number of groups looking to broaden these engagements out and take a more systemic approach. So that includes the PRI Sustainable Commodities Group, and also we're involved in these discussions around Nature Action 100, which is looking at taking an approach to Climate Action 100 to nature and biodiversity. In terms of the policy side of things, we've also been quite actively involved. And the reason for that is we do identify deforestation and biodiversity loss as a key systemic risk and part of the overall climate change picture, being a very critical part of that systemic risk. So we engage with policy makers. So we co-chair the Indonesia work stream of the Investor Policy Dialogue on Deforestation, which has been engaging with both the Indonesian and Brazilian governments over the last 18 months, right up through government, and also with other stakeholders in both those two countries to let both those governments know that investors really are concerned about this issue in those countries and concerned to really bring down rates of deforestation, albeit Indonesia's been very successful at that in recent years. We've also been involved in a letter to the UK Chancellor through our membership of the UK Sustainable Investment and Finance Association. We also engaged with the government on the international forestry provisions of the Environment Bill, and we've also signed up to an investor letter on COP. So again, we see these policy engagements as really critical and very much aligning with the corporate engagements. So what we need to do on that particular commitment by 2022 is to really look at where our portfolio is affected by these soft commodities. So in advance of signing up to the letter, we ran a mock initial screen on the commodities. Our data provider provides GIC data at a sub-industry level. There's 128 categories. Many of these sub-industries are unlikely to have a strong link to soft commodities. So we selected those that were, such as agricultural products, food, retail, forest products, packaged food and meat, paper packaging, etc. And then carried out further research on these companies to see if they're exposed or directly linked, and created a short list that was around 4% or 5% of our listed equities portfolio. So we've identified the gaps in that data. Obviously, supply chain is often a problem, which we're all aware of. In the industry classification only looks at the main classification of a company and doesn't tell us what a subsidiary might do. So, for example, one of our main engagements on deforestation at the moment is with a subsidiary of a mining company, but the subsidiary is a palm oil company. And private markets are obviously going to be more challenging and will involve more engagement with managers. And the TNFD is definitely going to help with this. And then there's the issues around disclosure. We didn't consider that to be as large an issue as finding the data, because we disclose a lot of information anyway. We're signatories to the 2020 UK Stewardship Code, PRI signatory. So we're used to disclosing and reporting around what we're doing on due diligence and engagement. And just finally, on the 2025 criteria, there was a requirement to increase investment in nature-based solutions. So again, we've got a key focus on investment in climate solutions, and already have about £400 million invested in sustainable forestry. Most of this is for timber. We've got ancillary ecosystem services. However, we would need a step price in carbon to make sure nature was available as an asset class of its own. So hopefully some of those discussions around Article 6, which Stephanie spoke about in relation to COP, will create that step pricing in carbon, which would enable nature to become its own asset class in terms of an investment class with a high which would meet our return requirements. So I'll leave it at that for now, but happy for any questions at the end.
Brilliant, thanks Olga, and yeah, wonderful way of setting us up by taking us through those 3 stages in the commitment. Thank you. I just want to remind all attendees to please be using the Q&A function for any questions that are coming up. So I think if we could get the slides back up. Brilliant, thank you. So now we are going to dive into the Deforestation Free Finance Roadmap. So we saw a need for the roadmap and guidance for financial institutions on how to eliminate deforestation from portfolios, given the lack of progress on this issue that Stephanie kind of through, but also, as Stephanie highlighted, the momentum that's coming now for the finance to be acting more on this. The roadmap we've developed with many partners, as you can see on the slide, presents clear, practical and high-level guidance for all types of financial institutions to be addressing deforestation, conversion, and also critically associated human rights risks in their financing activities. So it starts from scratch, it assumes no knowledge from the users and takes them through each step of becoming aware, assessing risk. It takes it through 5 phases, with sub-steps and actions. It represents best practice for financial institutions and builds off the best practice guidance of the accountability framework that is available for companies. And lastly, I just wanted to say it was developed with expert knowledge from many financial institutions, NGOs and experts that we're really grateful to their input and help on this. And it builds off a lot of existing work. So throughout it points out to recommended resources to get extra detailed guidance and data sets and tools that institutions should use at each step. But I'm now going to hand over to Emma Thompson, who is the technical lead on this roadmap, to take us through in much more detail. Thank you, Emma.
Thanks, Sarah. Hello everyone. As Sarah said, I'm now going to take you through the roadmap itself. So the roadmap was designed to be used by any and all financial institutions. So they could be at any stage of the process of eliminating deforestation, conversion, and associated human rights abuses from their portfolios. And as Sarah said, to enable this, the roadmap has 5 key phases, which, if I could have the next slide, please, thank you, are mapping risk, setting effective policies and managing that risk, monitoring and engagement, disclosure, and eliminating deforestation, as well as an additional phase going above and beyond. So these phases all enable financial institutions to rapidly determine which phase of the process they're at and then begin to use the roadmap from that point forward. So we really wanted this to be a tool that could be dipped into from any point. So as Sarah and Steph mentioned earlier, the roadmap does have a target date of 2025, and this timeline is taken all the way through the roadmap. So as you can see on the right-hand side, beginning at the end of 2021 with phase 1, and then running through to phase 5 by 2025. But as you can also see on the left-hand side, the roadmap does also provide an alternative timeline that financial institutions that are kind of starting the process a little bit later can start, so that they also have a rough idea of the timeline and the time period that each phase should take. And yeah, I'm now going to go through the structure of the roadmap in a bit more detail, but I'll go through this next bit very quickly as we'll be going through each phase in more detail as well. So if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So as you can see, each phase is broken down into 2 to 3 key steps. So as you can see in phase 1, this includes step A and step B, and then each of these steps is also broken down further into recommended actions. So these recommended actions are specific actions that can be taken by a financial institution to help them achieve that step. Next slide, please. And Each of these recommended action is then also divided into sub-actions, which, as you can see on the slide. So this, in this case, is to understand the systemic risk posed by deforestation, and also then understanding how financial institutions are exposed to those risks. Next slide, please. Thank you. So each of these sub-actions goes into further detail on exactly what this looks like in line with the best practice for the industry, and also provides links to different resources that we've referred to. And then the next slide, please. Thank you. So as Sarah mentioned, alongside the guidance itself, the roadmap also provides links to additional materials and resources that can be used. So as you can see on the slide, we provide this for recommended data sets and tools. So these can all be used by a financial institution within the implementation of that specific step or recommended action. And as you can see, the roadmap also provides a short description of the data set or tool and a summary of how that can be used in the implementation. Next slide, please. And then the final key part of the structure is that the roadmap brings together additional guidance pieces in a singular place. So we provide a list of supplementary guidance that goes into additional levels of detail on specific actions, which you can see here. And along with the rest of the roadmap, the data sets and tools and supplementary guidance listed in this guidance piece and on our website will be kept updated. So as tools and new guidance is developed or introduced, they will be incorporated into the roadmap, which you can access at deforestationfreefinance.org. Next slide, please. So now we've gone through the very quick bit. We will now go through the guidance itself. So starting with phase 1, this phase provides guidance on how a financial institution can map their exposure to deforestation risk. So as you can see, the roadmap breaks this down into 2 steps. Step A being understanding the risks posed by deforestation, conversion, and associated human rights abuses. And step B being conducting an initial assessment of a financial institution's exposure to those risks. Step A is a fundamental starting point for financial institutions which want to address deforestation in their portfolios. The roadmap starts here to ensure that all financial institutions that use this roadmap have a clear understanding of how deforestation is a risk to the finance sector as a whole, but also how the finance sector, and in particular their institution, is exposed to deforestation, conversion, and associated human rights abuses through their financing activities. This is done through the recommended resources and data sets, but also through collaborative knowledge sharing with multi-stakeholder initiatives, as you can see in recommended action 2. So then moving on to step B, and I just want to note that while these steps are done in an alphabetical order, there is no clear recommendation of which step should be conducted in which order within that phase. So it really is just about which order works best for that specific financial institution within its pre-existing processes. So while the phase is recommended in order, the individual steps can be done whichever way is best. So step B provides guidance through an initial assessment of deforestation, conversion, and human rights abuse risks. So this takes the financial institution through from identifying clients or holdings which may have a high exposure to those risks. So by identifying which clients or holdings are in or are financing high-risk sectors, and identifying which clients are producing, processing, curing, or financing forest risk commodities from high-risk regions. So in this step, the roadmap provides recommendations on metrics and information which can be used, including which sectors and countries do have a high deforestation and conversion risk, as well as the additional data sets and tools that can be used within this step. By the end of step B and the end of phase 1, the financial institution will have a high level of understanding of their exposure to deforestation risk, and then be able to move on to phase 2. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So phase 2 is all about setting an effective policy and managing risk. So again, this phase has 2 steps, but here step A focuses on completing an in-depth risk assessment, and step B focuses on setting an effective policy. The guidance in step A builds directly off the high-level risk assessment conducted in phase 1. And it really focuses on enabling the financial institution to identify their actual exposure to deforestation, conversion, and human rights abuse risks. And firstly, this step looks at gaining an accurate picture of the actual exposure to that risk. But then we build from there to include what the clients or holdings performance on deforestation, conversion, and human rights abuses is. So what kind of steps they're taking to mitigate that exposure. So this step walks the user through what kind of questions they should be seeking to answer, what data can be used to answer those questions, and how to access or request that data from either companies, ESG providers, or a comprehensive set of other tools, including public reporting mechanisms, independent human rights assessments, and satellite verification. The guidance also recommends that clients or holdings can be ranked based on their exposure to those risks, but also the steps they're taking to mitigate them. Once that's been done, the roadmap then does provide guidance on how categorizing clients into high risk, medium risk, and low risk can be used during the engagement processes in later steps. Moving on to step B of phase 2. So setting an effective policy is a fundamental step of successfully eliminating deforestation and conversion from a financial portfolio. The roadmap breaks this step down into 3 clear recommended actions. So as you can see, setting a strong policy, communicating the requirements of that policy to clients or holdings, and setting a clear threshold for engagement. So recommended action 1 includes publishing the strong policy, so specifically committing the financial institution to eliminate deforestation, conversion, and associated human rights abuses from their portfolios by 2025. And this specifically includes both legal and illegal conversion and deforestation. And what's also really key here is ensuring that that policy is embedded within existing policies, processes, and contracts. And although the roadmap does specifically cover palm oil, soy, timber, pulp and paper, beef, and leather, this policy can also be extended to other highly exposed industries and other forest risk commodities, including cocoa, coffee, and rubber as well. To ensure successful engagement, it's also key that these requirements of the policy and the expectations for companies and clients and holdings are clearly communicated to any existing as well as new and prospective clients or holdings. And the roadmap includes guidance on how to do this in recommended action 2. And the final recommended action of this phase is to set and communicate a clear threshold for engagement. So this should include a threshold based on the exposure to deforestation risk, based on the in-depth risk assessment conducted in step A, as well as setting a threshold based on non-compliance with the policy. So once the strong policy has been set and these thresholds have been communicated to clients or holdings, financial institutions can then move on to step 3, which is monitoring and engagement. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. Phase 3 is also broken down into 2 steps. So firstly, engaging clients or holdings, and then secondly, engaging beyond clients or holdings. So step A, as you can see, is split into 3 recommended actions. So starting with engaging the clients or holdings, which were identified as having the highest risk in the in-depth risk assessment in phase 2. And then this engagement includes discussing the results of that risk assessment with the client or holding directly, as well as things like reaching out to organizations which host relevant working groups, which could maybe facilitate group engagement or knowledge share. And then finally, to engage with the client to develop a time-bound plan to become compliant with the policy requirements. This engagement at this point in the roadmap should really be for the highest priority clients or holdings, to make sure that they're being engaged on the issue as early on in the process as possible, as they are the ones that have the most improvement to make to ensure that financial institutions can eliminate deforestation by 2025. So once this has been done, the roadmap then provides guidance on how to annually screen and monitor all clients or holdings using a variety of data sets and tools, which can enable a financial institution to identify the client or holdings exposure to risk and actions to mitigate that exposure. So this recommended action is very closely linked to step A in phase B, so the in-depth risk assessment, but with a few variations, such as monitoring their progress compared to the previous years of assessment or the previous in-depth risk assessment as well. So this recommended action also looks at non-compliance on the ground. So this would include, for instance, cases of known deforestation or ecosystem conversion. And this recommended action features guidance on how to assess the severity of that non-compliance, which can then be used in recommended action 3 to structure engagement. And what's really key about this recommended action is gaining input from Indigenous peoples, local communities, and rights holders who were directly impacted by that non-compliance on the ground. Recommended action 3 provides guidance on engaging those clients or holdings. So beginning with those with the highest exposure to risk. And again, as in recommended action 1, involves meeting with the representative or management of the client or holding to explain the results of the monitoring process and to discuss with the client or holding what the next steps should be. And this should be supported by working with the client to update that time-bound plan for compliance, which is something they are required to set in step B of phase 2, and also to develop an implementation plan to remedy any non-compliance or deforestation on the ground. The key step of this engagement is that it continues and that financial institutions actively monitor the clients or holdings progress towards their time-bound plans and remediation activities. And then step B, I'll go through it quite quickly. It really revolves around engaging with other financial institutions to share knowledge and foster collaboration, but also to engage ESG data providers on the need for better data, and also to communicate what the preferred data and data sources are. And then finally, as you can see, advocating for strong due diligence legislation, not just for companies, but also for financial institutions themselves. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, we're halfway through the roadmap. So phase 4 is all about disclosure and transparency. So greater transparency is really needed to enable financial institutions to eliminate deforestation, conversion, and human rights abuses from their portfolios by 2025, including greater transparency from financial institutions themselves. This disclosure can be done through pre-existing reporting frameworks and sustainability reports, as well as other reporting mechanisms that may come out in the coming years. So as you can see, step A is specifically about the public disclosure of progress on deforestation and conversion and associated human rights risks. So this really includes guidance on disclosing the results of the in-depth risk assessment. For instance, how many clients or holdings are categorized as high risk. And then recommended action 2 provides guidance on how to annually report on progress made towards the deforestation policy based on the annual monitoring cycles. The roadmap does also provide guidance on third-party verification of the results of that screening and monitoring process, as well as on publishing the details of any grievances raised either against the financial institution over that year or against the clients or holdings that they finance as well. And then the final recommended action for step A is to annually report on engagement activities. So how many clients or holdings have been engaged, how and why they were engaged, and what the outcomes of that engagement were. And then as you can see, step B focuses on publicly acknowledging deforestation as a risk for the finance sector. So specifically referring to the systemic risk that conversion, deforestation, and human rights abuses pose to the finance sector. The next slide, please. Thank you. So phase 5 is the final kind of formal phase of the roadmap. And this phase, as you can see, is eliminating deforestation. So this is an ongoing phase. It is something that should be continued, and it feeds very heavily from the previous phases that we've just covered. So as you can see, phase 5 has 3 steps. And the first is to continue engagement. The second is to continue publishing annual progress reports. And finally, to redirect financing away from clients or holdings that are making too little progress. So step A revolves around continuing to regularly engage clients or holdings which are exposed to deforestation, conversion, and associated human rights risks. So this specifically includes those that are either identified to be non-compliant with the requirements of the financial institution policy, but also those that are connected to deforestation or conversion on the ground. So this step ends by encouraging the financial institutions to identify which of their clients or holdings have consistently made too little progress towards the requirements of the policy, and thus those which need stronger engagement, as well as those which should be considered for the redirection of finance in step C. Now moving on to step B. This one is all about the continued publishing of annual progress reports, and specifically including information such as the number and name of clients or holdings that have been monitored for compliance with the policy in the past year, the outcomes of that monitoring for compliance, including key data points that have been outlined further on up in the roadmap, and then finally the outcomes of any engagement activities. So that's all about disclosure. And then step C is really about providing guidance on if, when, and how financial institutions should consider redirecting finance away from clients or holdings that have continued to be non-compliant with the policy requirements, and those who have consistently been involved in deforestation and conversion on the ground. So as in phase 3, this includes assessing the severity of non-compliance on the ground and determining the next steps needed from that client or holding. And a really fundamental part of this process is engaging with Indigenous peoples, local communities, and rights holders on the ground before a financial institution decides whether or not to redirect financing away. If the decision is taken to redirect financing away from clients or holding, it's really important that the financial institutions communicate this reason to the client or holding, and there is guidance provided on that within the roadmap. Step C is really the last resort financial institutions can take to address their exposure to deforestation, conversion, and associated human rights abuses. The power of most financial institutions really is in the leverage that their financing provides and their ability to engage their clients or holdings to bring them into compliance. And engagement is absolutely fundamental in eliminating deforestation, conversion, and human rights by 2025. Next slide, please. So on to the final phase of the roadmap, which is, as you can see, called Going Above and Beyond. And this phase really provides guidance on increasing nature and people positive financing. This phase, unlike the others, doesn't really have a recommended timeline, as it's something that can be done and implemented throughout any stage of the roadmap. So wherever it fits best into the process, and wherever the financial institution wants to start. And yeah, as I said, this phase is really about increasing nature and people positive financing, but also really key is ensuring that due diligence is conducted on any nature and people positive investments, activities, and projects, and ensuring that they too are compliant with the financing policy that has been set, and in particular that the free, prior, and informed consent of local communities and Indigenous peoples has been secured. So that was a mostly brief summary of the roadmap, which is a really comprehensive resource that links out, but I will now hand back to Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. That was a brilliant amount of detail to take us through the roadmap. Thank you so much for doing that. I just wanted to highlight for everyone also that we are seeing this roadmap as a living thing. It will be updated as best practice, data, more guidance becomes available. And in the near future, we do have some updates coming that brings it into even greater alignment with the Accountability Framework Initiative guidance for the company. And we're really pleased to say that the Accountability Framework Initiative has endorsed the updated version. So there will be some updates coming over the next few weeks. No changes to the structure and the phases and steps that Emma laid out, but kind of some of the details and the language. So we're really pleased about that. And yeah, we see it as a kind of living thing going into the future that will continue to be strengthened. So we now have time for Q&A. So please do keep adding questions in using the Q&A function. The first one, I think straight back to you, Emma, apologies, but just wanted to ask you about some additional guidance that you've got planned in the pipeline, thinking more specifically about different types of financial institutions. Could you maybe tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Yep. So as we've said, the roadmap is a very kind of high-level document that any financial institution can use, and we are planning on following it up with actor-specific guidance pieces. So although the roadmap can be used by any financial institution, we really do want to kind of make a resource that enables financial institutions to dig into the detail of exactly what they can do and how it relates to their specific connection to deforestation on the ground. So to do that, we are working with, again, more partners to develop guidance for pension funds with Systemic and Make My Money Matter. We're also looking at guidance for banks in partnership with Tropical Forest Alliance, and also for family offices and foundations, and a few others as well. That's enough for now. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Question to you, Steph, about the commitment that we saw at COP. Why do you think that this commitment is different to other commitments that we've seen before? Why do you think there's cause for optimism?
Thanks so much, Sarah. I think it's a good question because we have seen a lot of voluntary commitments in the past around various climate commitments or deforestation commitments. What I will say I think is different right now is we're in a different moment globally. There's a lot of momentum building in different places. There's public pressure mounting from a lot of different angles to really address climate change with urgency for all actors. There's urgency building from the government side where we see some regulatory plans in the pipe, due diligence policies. The political situation generally, I think, has evolved. The data has advanced. So there's a lot more certainty that can be put on both action and on the accountability of those actions. So I think really it's a moment where, there can be valid and important reflection on why past voluntary commitments may not have succeeded. But I think we take those lessons and bring them to this situation where we have developed this roadmap that can show a clear implementation plan and how we'll track progress toward it. We can show how these are stepwise benchmarks within the broader net zero conversation. And all of these reasons, I think, together, I think it is a very much a moment for optimism that we are all working together from the same hymn sheet to really push forward on progress in this way.
Brilliant, thank you, Steph. And I guess maybe a little bit related to that, Olga, I'd love to hear from you what kind of drove you and the Church Commissioners of England to start on this journey and to think about making this commitment.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think primarily something which the other panelists have already referred to in the biodiversity and deforestation is a very large part of that, is being increasingly recognised by investors as a very serious systemic risk that has to be acknowledged, both in terms of impact and dependency. Sorry, my voice has managed to go right at the moment I answer the question. So there's a realisation there's an ecological crisis around the world, and there has been this sharp focus from investors on climate. But I think stemming from that is a realisation that biodiversity is a really critical part of that picture, and then deforestation and the part that deforestation plays in protecting the climate as part of the global climate puzzle and climate solutions. In a way, it's a very low, if we can address the issue to the extent we can, and I'm optimistic we can, it is a low-lying fruit in the climate puzzle. So that discussion has come up quite a lot. Again, as I've mentioned, we're an endowment, but we have a lot of money invested in sustainable forestry, but we also own a lot of land. So have been looking at issues in relation to woodland and biodiversity on our land, which we hold in England, primarily the forestries around the world. The sustainable forestry. So again, it's something as a large landholder we've been traditionally looking at. So they'd be the two primary reasons.
Brilliant. And maybe as a follow-up, I mean, how do you see any ways that we can kind of raise that awareness of that systemic risk to bring other financial institutions on board to get this sector-wide action?
Yeah, I think just keep speaking to them. Again, everybody's acutely aware of the climate crisis and is talking about that. But this is such a huge part of that puzzle. You know, it's what was the fact that before it's larger than the whole of the EU's emissions. So I think when you put forward statistics like that, it becomes very apparent to investors and other financial institutions how critical this part of the picture is. And also the impact which both impact and dependencies of nature play in supply chains and the goods which are produced. You know, most goods which companies produce are either mined or farmed ultimately. So what is the impact of that, and what will be the impact on our portfolios in the long term of those activities?
Great, thank you. Emma, a question to you from a participant on kind of, well, I'll read it out. So the effort to eliminate legal deforestation is commendable and necessary, but may equate able to use part of their land. So as legal deforestation is a right, how does the roadmap propose to address this problem within the legal framework of the nations where deforestation occurs?
Thank you. Yeah, it is a very complicated topic, and it is something we have been very sensitive on when we've been providing guidance and writing the guidance. And it is something we've been consulting other NGOs and financial institutions on as well as part of the process. I think the key thing that the roadmap really focuses on is that even where deforestation is, even where there is some deforestation that is legal and some that is illegal, in a lot of times, the enforcement of those laws isn't necessarily adequate, and means that illegal deforestation can still be occurring in supply chains or finance projects, and also that potentially the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities aren't protected. So the reason that we've advocated for financial institutions to include both illegal and legal deforestation in their policies is to address those human rights risks, and to also, yeah, ensure that they're even, sorry, misspoke, and to ensure that they are reducing the risks that deforestation poses to themselves, including regulatory, and regulations change frequently. It is obviously a huge issue for individuals that do have rights to their land and can deforest legally, and that is something that we will really be looking to provide more detailed guidance on in future guidance pieces. But for this very high level guidance piece that was applicable for all financial institutions, we did really want to provide guidance that could cover all financial institutions and financing options.
Thank you. And thanks for the questions. Please do keep them coming in. We've still got a few minutes left. Steph, I wanted to come back to you and maybe hear a little about plans going forward. How can we continue to bring financial institutions on board and maybe widen out?
Great, thank you, Sarah. Yeah, I think it's critical to turn this momentum from COP into broad system shift, and one of the key ways of doing that is just what we're doing here, where Olga has graciously agreed to join this conversation. And I think, you know, the messengers are so important in this space. So having this core group of front runners from the finance sector to talk to their peers and reach out and encourage uptake and keep that momentum going, that information sharing going, I think is a key focus of our advisory group to support that process. So in particular, we're looking at expanding to more producer countries. So we've translated the roadmap into Portuguese, and we'll be doing so with other languages as well. We'll continue to, of course, refine it to those contexts, because the finance landscape is different, you know, in different national contexts as well. So we're looking at working, for example, with a Brazilian climate coalition that has a working group on finance, and making sure that that the guidance and support is in place to move progress forward for all different types of institutions, as well as all different geographies. In particular on banks, what we're doing on that front is working, as Emma mentioned, with Tropical Forest Alliance as well as UNEP FI to really hone in on the unique position that banks may be in, and figure out how to kind of unlock momentum in that space going forward. So it's definitely an issue of focus, and you know, not solely focus, but very much we'll expand that in the next year, along with all the other types of specific guidance that Emma mentioned going forward.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm afraid I'm coming back to you with another big question, but I will read it out. So we want to be optimistic and look at the glass half full when it comes to celebrating big talks around the role of nature in COP. However, reality is extremely different. So deforestation in the Amazon increased by 45%, that have made some of these pledges are actually either the root cause or invest in portfolios that are ultimately funding deforestation. So what measures can be put in place to go beyond risk and halt these activities altogether?
Yeah, thank you. So the roadmap does, as I'm sure you noticed in the presentation, really use the language of risk, and that is really it includes both the risk to the financial institution, but also the risk of the deforestation conversion itself. And that changes in the roadmap and in the detailed guidance itself. It is very clear where they differ, where they switch between the two things. The roadmap, although it does use the language of risk a lot, is really about eliminating deforestation, conversion, and associated human rights abuses by 2025. And that's not reducing the risk, it is reducing them and eliminating them by 2025. And it is, of course, to do with the risk that it poses to financial institutions and the risk that it poses to us all, but it really does come down to removing those from portfolios and from financing and from supply chains. So the roadmap and the future guidance pieces will continue with that aim of eliminating them, but also all of the tools and the recommended data sets and tools we use will all push for that action to eliminate them on the ground.
Brilliant, thank you. And then, sorry, straight back to you, Emma, but a couple of questions on planned guidance. So you can probably answer these in one go in guidance, and what are the priorities there? And the second question is the roadmap applicable to development finance institutions, so development banks?
Thank you. Yeah, so I guess I'll start with the reverse. So the roadmap is designed to be applicable to any financial institution of any type at any stage in the process. And although it does provide very high level guidance, it does provide that guidance that any type of financial institution can use. So although it doesn't go into the details of the exact processes that a development bank would need to use, it does provide the high level guidance of, okay, so we can do this high level risk assessment, we can set a policy, we can do our in-depth risk assessment and move through. And then in terms of the next steps of the guidance, as I mentioned, we are working on those actor specific guidance pieces, and we are beginning with pension funds, and we've got pension funds and banks confirmed, and we're also looking at family offices and foundations, asset managers, and a few others as well, including potentially development banks and other types of banks. And if there are any kind of specific types of guidance or guidance pieces for specific financial institutions that you think would be really useful, then we would always love to hear what that is and maybe have a chat about why that's important and what we can do to create that guidance. I hope that answers the question.
It does, definitely, thank you. So I think that is pretty much all we've got time for today. Thank you so much to everyone for the questions that come in, and thank you so much to our speakers. It's been wonderful to have you. When we close this webinar, there will be a really short survey popping up in your browsers just to get some feedback on the webinar and what you might be interested in hearing more about in the future. So please do take just a few seconds to fill that out. We'd really appreciate it. But thank you so much to everyone for joining, speakers and attendees, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your days. Thanks.